there's a lot of research that looks at kind of the persistent ability of investment bankers, and whether it be initial public offerings, acquisitions, leverage buyouts, and so on. And this literature tries to identify whether investment bankers actually have persistent ability, whether there's some skill that differentiates top investment bankers from weaker investment bankers. Instead of looking at kind of, are there banks that are persistently better, I look at, are there cases where any given bank can be made better? And really the great equalizer in advising IPOs and acquisitions is, do you have information? So everyone knows that information is important and valuable. I think one of the takeaways from this research is the half-life of information is actually fairly long. This information is used 3, 5, 10 years later and still has some value. So that the value of the underwriting the IPO is not just the fees underwriting the IPO generates today, it's the information you generate, this expertise you generate. You can use this later on. I just use the two biggest events in the life of a firm. These are the initial public offering and the acquisition. Both these are huge, costly, risky events that are very information intensive. So I find cases where the target in their initial public offering is advised by one bank, and I find when that bank goes on to advise the acquirer in a subsequent acquisition. So this creates a real information channel. So now the banker that generates a lot of information during the IPO can use that information in acquiring that same firm later on. So in these cases where the acquirer's advisor underwrote the IPO of the target, announcement day returns are about 2.5% better. So this suggests the market deems these to be much better outcomes. Now, is this just some sort of rent extraction? Are these actually better acquisitions? And it seems that they are. So there's not a worse response on the target. It really is just the market responding positively to this combined new entity. The types of banks that are doing this, they're uniformly spread across the big names and the small names. So it's not entirely a Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley effect. And once I control for the persistent ability of these banks, this affects about 2% instead of 2.5%, but it's still very, very strong. Another consideration may be this is just concentrated in some time period or explained by some industry, and that's also not the case. While the effect is stronger in the latter half of the sample, that seems pretty reasonable and consistent with the idea that if the real source of this edge is information retention should be much bigger or better in the later half of the sample. After about 3 to 5 years, the market's response to these acquisitions starts to get a little bit more muted. So there's still slightly better acquisitions, it's just by a much smaller size as time goes on. So as this information gets older and older, as you'd expect, the ability to kind of make a better match or a better deal starts to decay.